You're listening to episode 151, From Chaos and Addiction to Peace and Sobriety with Lisa Boucher. Welcome to the Grass Gets Greener podcast, the show for survivors by survivors. I'm your host, Melissa Wilson, a bullying survivor and anti-bullying advocate. And each week you'll hear from a survivor who has overcome a traumatic experience to go on to not only survive, but thrive, so that you can too, starting now. Hey there, welcome, and thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the podcast. I'm so grateful to have you here. And today we're going to be joined by Lisa Boucher of raisingthebottom.com. Before we get into it, I want to let you know that this episode is sponsored by Navni. Navni is the top-ranked anonymous writing website in the world. Navni provides free wellness resources and low-cost online therapy services to help people cope with various levels of emotional distress. Write anonymously, feel better at novni.com. Lisa is an award-winning author of Raising the Bottom, Making Mindful Choices in a Drinking Culture, as well as a registered nurse. And Lisa joins us today to talk about how she went from a chaotic upbringing and battling alcohol addiction to becoming sober and finding a new identity in the process of her recovery. In particular, she's going to talk about her experience of growing up in a home where her mother battled addictions and how having a horse helped Lisa when she was growing up, and how drinking has become normalized in our culture. And she'll talk about what led her to become sober when she was 29, and how alcohol addiction can lead to misdiagnoses of mental health disorders. And she'll share her recovery journey and the struggles that she faced along the way, and the moment in her recovery when everything clicked for her, and how she got to discover her true identity after becoming sober. And she'll also talk about how we can become addicted to chaos or being a victim. And she'll talk about her book, Raising the Bottom, and also the importance of being honest with ourselves. So lots of good stuff in here, and if you come from a traumatic background and are battling an alcohol or drug addiction right now, then I definitely encourage you to listen to Lisa's story today. And even if you don't consider yourself to have an addiction, but you use alcohol or drugs, I encourage you to listen to Lisa's story as well. And so without further ado, we'll go ahead and get into this one, and I'll go bring Lisa on. Lisa, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining me here today to share your story with us.
Thank you for having me, Melissa. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you here. And when I came across your story and the work you're doing today, I knew I wanted to have you on the show to share your journey with us. We're going to talk today about recovering from alcoholism, and whenever I've had someone on the show who has dealt with this as a result of the upbringing they had, it's always been received very well because, unfortunately, a lot of people who come from an abusive or traumatic past do turn to various substances to help them cope. So it's great to talk about it and shine some light on it, and hopefully this will be helpful to anyone listening who may be battling an addiction of their own right now. And so what I'd like to do here, Lisa, is have you start us out by sharing with us a little bit about your background and what life was like for you growing up, and then we'll go from there. Does that sound good to you?
That sounds good, Melissa.
Yeah, so go for it. I mean, just take a few minutes and share with us a summary of what you experienced.
Growing up, and I have two older sisters and a younger brother. So there's four of us. And I grew up in what appeared from the outside looking in to be a very normal family. My mother was a registered nurse. My father was a businessman. But the environment in the home, due to what happened since I was a little kid, so I don't think that I ever lived in a normal environment. There was always dysfunction because my mother got addicted to benzos. She got addicted to Valium that was prescribed by a doctor. And from my youngest years that I can remember at 4 or 5, it was a lot of car accidents. I know in my book, Raising the Bottom, I talk about there's a scene where back then we didn't wear seatbelts, and I'm holding my younger brother who's an infant, and it's snowing. I grew up in Northeast Ohio, so the snow is just falling crazy fast. And we were always going to the drugstore, and my mother is in shorts and she's got sandals on and beautiful blue eyes, very bleary, pink lipstick. It's a memory I'll never forget. And we're going down this country road way too fast, and we end up swoosh in a deep ditch. And my brother fell on the floor like a loose gourd. So those kinds of things happened over and over and over again as a child. So if I can think of one emotion, it would be fear between my mother's alcoholism and then my father, perhaps as a result of her instability, was angry, controlling, and at times abusive, physically abusive. I think he was emotionally abusive, verbally abusive. So as a child, I just remember feeling scared all the time. There was just no one who was able to, there was very little nurturing. I mean, my mother was a very loving woman when she wasn't drinking or under the influence of benzos, but her addiction it just predominated through my entire life. She didn't get sober until I was 21. So through my entire childhood into teenage, and then I left home 2 days after graduation from high school. So I never really had that mother or those parents who were loving, who were nurturing, because my mother was often passed out. And her addiction really escalated with alcohol. And she hit an extremely low bottom. And in her defense, she did try to get help. She went to numerous therapists, counselors, the hospital. She was in the psych ward multiple times, and they never really seemed to get their finger on the pulse of what the problem was, and kept misdiagnosing her over and over again with depression, manic depression, anxiety, all of these mental health diagnoses that really, after she got sober, were not accurate at all. She basically was an alcoholic and an addict. And once she got that under control, she went to rehab, started in a 12-step program, and she never looked back. Like I said, she had wanted to find some help, but healthcare never helped her. And I'm a registered nurse now, and I work in that arena, and I see the same thing happening over and over. What happened to my mother in the 60s and 70s continues to happen today. And it's disturbing. It's a shame, because you see so many lives spiraling down the drain, and least we forget there are children, like I was that child, on the backside of the one in crisis. And so not only did it impact my mother, my father, my siblings, that's 5 other people that were impacted by her addiction. And yet she never got the right kind of help, even when she was reaching out for help. So it was a traumatic environment to grow up in. There was a lot of screaming, yelling, fighting, like I said, some physical violence, and that just doesn't render itself to growing up as a peaceful child. You grow up and you're rather anxious and nervous. And I did have a horse, and we lived out kind of in the country, and I think that saved me in a lot of ways. And I love how equine therapy, that they have that now, because I think horses are extremely healing. And I think that is what kept me from hitting my addiction in those teenage years hard. I think it could have been a very different story for me, because I did start drinking and smoking a little pot at 12 years old. So had I not had that wholesome reprieve with my horse, that became the central character really in my life. And I still grieve this horse and love this horse, that he was probably the most significant thing in my childhood. And I do think that helped me tremendously. So I'm a real advocate of equine therapy for trauma, for healing from any sorts of trauma. I think it's just amazing, the healing power of horses.
Mm. Oh, that's awesome. And yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that as we get into, the things that helped you get to where you are now in a little bit later. But, thank you for sharing your story and your experience with us of what things were like for you growing up. And yeah, I mean, certainly that's not, a good environment to be growing up in, not a healthy environment to be growing up in. And that's unfortunate, that your mom wasn't able to get the help that she was looking for at the time. And so for you, Lisa, I mean, growing up in this environment and for it sort of, being the norm for you, right, from a very early age, I'm curious, did the alcohol use seem normal to you? Or were you able to recognize as a child that this was something that was, problematic?
Well, here's the really baffling part with my mother's alcoholism. So, like I said, her addiction started with pills. So when we were younger, it was mostly pills. I never saw her drink other than card club they used to have once a month with friends. Maybe the occasional, like at Christmas, she was always mixing grasshoppers in the blender. I remember that, the cream de mint and the vanilla ice cream, the grasshoppers. And she used to make, I think, daiquiris. She always liked everything sweet. So that was really the portrayal of drinking, which was very normal and social looking. It was her falling down, passing out from whatever prescription medication she was already addicted to. And so I remember her many, many times just being passed out on the couch. And as kids, you're trying to open her eyelids with your finger going, get up, get up. And she just couldn't rouse herself. So there was that. And then my dad was not a big drinker. So it wasn't like the house was fueled with alcohol everywhere. But as a result of her inability to parent well, we were running amok, basically. All of us kids. My brother would build these outrageously high ramps in the driveway and fling himself in his bikes. And so he was doing that. And just, we used to have snowmobiles and like he was always riding some machine or whatever. So that was kind of his escape. My older sister babysat a lot. My other sister was always a bit off the wall and maybe had some mental health issues, and she was kind of a runner. So everyone is just floundering in their own way. And then as we got to be teenagers, it became the fun house, more or less, where my mother was one of those people that did buy the beer. She was inappropriate. She was, the fun mom, in quotes, that as a teenager, you think, oh, this is great. And I do have memories of throngs of friends, and we're sitting around the kitchen table smoking. I'm smoking cigarettes when I'm 16. This is when my dad would be out of town. And she was like one of your girlfriends. So she wasn't parenting well. But when you're in that, you don't really realize how dysfunctional, and you don't realize until you're later an adult that, wow, I have no coping skills. I have no life skills. And you just sort of go on your wits and learn to deal with things the way you did, when you're dealing with a lot of things and just handling your life when you're really too young to know if you're doing it right or not. So that was kind of how her addiction showed up. And then it wasn't until I was probably 14, 15 that her drinking started to come into the picture. But here again, it wasn't like she was sloused around the house drinking, but we did find bottles in the bathroom, in the car. I remember her a couple times having my brother and I empty all these bottles out of her car and take them to the field across the street and throw them out because she didn't want my father to see them and put them in the trash. So I remember things like that's not normal to have a parent doing that. But here again, she wasn't sitting around drinking, but you knew she was drinking somewhere, because then the slurred language or the falling down on the floor or the time, I talk about all of these. Some of it is tragic and some of it is tragically funny in Raising the Bottom, I talk about where my brother and I, the house is filling with smoke, and we find my mother on the dining room floor, under the dining room table, passed out cold. And the kitchen is just this black smoke everywhere. So we're trying to get her out, and she's dead weight. We're trying to drag her. And then I realized this black acrid smoke is coming out of the oven. Well, bless her heart, she was cooking dinner, but she never took the chicken out of the package.
Oh,
So
no.
it used to, in the day, it came with the styrofoam bottom and then the plastic wrap, very much like it does now. Well, that's what she plopped in the oven. She was clearly too drunk to realize she didn't open the package or put it in a pan. So these kinds of incidents, I remember coming home the first time when she was passed out like that and calling 911 multiple times, because as a teenager, when you find a parent on the floor and you can't get them up, you don't know. At the first time it happened, I had no idea it was because of drugs. I thought she could be dead. I don't know what I thought. I just called 911, and eventually that became a pattern. So you do that enough times. And then I remember just calling 911 and going. Then I was working as a waitress at the time while I was still in high school, and then going to my job, because after that happens 3 or 4 times, you realize a pattern here. And on the most of the times when I'd have to call 911 is if my dad was out of town and I didn't know what else to do. So you do this, you think they're dead, you're scared, your heart rate, everything goes up, but that happens enough time and it becomes, you almost compartmentalize these little traumas that continue to happen. And it almost seems normal then. It's it's abnormal, but this is just then the way it is. And the pattern would be find her passed out in any number of places, not be able to wake her, call the ambulance, she'd go to the hospital, in a week or two, she'd be home. And they'd admit her to the psych ward. And she never came out of the psych ward looking any better, doing any better. In fact, it made things worse, because then she would get so heavily medicated on antipsychotics like Thorazine. They used quite a bit back then. We don't use it as much now, but so Thorazine, Librium, who knows if they kept her on the Valium? I believe they probably did. So she's got this benzo addiction. And then the doctors are throwing antipsychotics on it in a person who is not psychotic. So you can imagine how this just made her really like a zombie. It was terribly sad.
Just a bad combination of things right there.
Yeah, I mean, and then this person who is your mother, and she was so full of life and a very fun person, to just see her sitting there like a zombie, that's traumatic in itself, because it's not who she is.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like you just want to shake and say, where is my mom? Where is my mom?
Right.
Yeah, so that went on and on. So those sorts of things were ongoing. But it was only later as an adult was I able to look back and go, wow, that is very strange. I don't remember seeing a lot of alcohol around the house. And eventually she was a little sloppier with it. But when we had this one lady who would help her clean the house, this Russian woman who they liked to read tea leaves. So I think she hired this one lady because she liked to drink like my mom. So she would have my mom would go pick her up at the bus stop, bring her home to help her clean the house. They'd start brewing the tea, reading tea leaves, drinking vodka, and everything would be a mess. And the cleaning lady would end up passed on the couch. So it was this kind of insanity that happened over and over again, that here again, when you're growing up in it, well, that seemed normal to me. I didn't realize how abnormal it was until I got sober later on in my 20s. So it never occurred to me how abnormal all of this insanity going on in the home was until I found my own recovery. And then looking back, it's like, oh my goodness, how did any of us stay sane in that environment? Because it was just one chaotic moment after the next. And that's how it went. So
Yeah,
I left home.
sure.
Yeah,
And then you said you started drinking when you were 12?
I did. So not heavily. As I was talking about with my horse, I think that saved me because he became my best friend and his care. And I just spent a lot of time. And I did have a very idyllic place to ride, which was another saving grace that I didn't realize how blessed I was to have that. Being where we lived in Northeast Ohio, it was quite country. So there were miles and miles and miles of trails that were beautiful. There was a lake, I remember. There was just a number of ways to go. So that kept me from drinking heavily, I would think.
Mm.
I did start to drink more heavily when I got my driver's license, and I also stole my older sister's driver's license. So now I'm technically of age. And back when I was drinking, they had 3-2 beer. So, no, I think actually I stole my sister's driver's license when I was 15. So she was 18. So then I could start drinking the 3-2 beer. And we used to go to Tony's Bar, which was a hangout down by the university. It was a campus bar back then down by Youngstown State University. And we I drank a lot down there, but mostly on the weekends, just mostly on the weekend nights. But a lot of crazy episodes were happening already. I do remember um, sometimes not remembering exactly. I remember getting sick a lot when I came home. So that's abnormal. I didn't have an off button, I don't think, back then, getting wasted when you're only 15, 16. So that went on. And that's pretty much how I drank through those high school years. And then, like I said, I left home 2 days after graduation. I packed up and I said, I'm out of here. This place is too nuts for me. And I moved to Columbus, Ohio on campus. So the drinking continued. But when you're in your 20s, I think you can get away with a lot of bad behavior. And
Mm.
we really normalized it in our culture now.
Yeah, there's something kind of normal about it, right?
Well, there really is. I saw just last week they have now 5% alcohol they're putting in pudding.
And
And they
pudding.
have, yeah, in pudding. So they almost look like little yogurt cups, and they're in pink and white and they look all festive, but there's 5% alcohol in them. I can't imagine how disgusting that would probably taste, but it's just like, wow, it's over the top anymore. And I saw Jack Daniels and Coke popsicles. So the alcohol companies are introducing alcohol in ways that were unfathomable back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, even. It's just unbelievable to me how it's ubiquitous everywhere you turn, mixing the alcohol with painting, with yoga, with there was a thing at the garden center at one garden center where it was ladies' days to come buy your flowers and have wine, bridal boutiques, nail salons, wine. So we're really opening the door to see a lot more alcoholism, a lot more women, especially because they are being specifically targeted. Um, Women are becoming the number one wine buyers. They say the new alcoholic wears designer pumps and carries a diaper bag. When I was doing research for my book, the number of, I mean, just we could go on and take this down a million different
Yeah.
rabbit holes
It's
with, college campuses, the things that are going on, the rapes, a lot of it is when women are under the influence, and you give up your power when we can't defend ourselves because we're too drunk. It doesn't justify bad things happening, but let's face it, there's not nice people in the world who will take advantage in any way they can. And so it's just such a part of our culture that is so destructive.
Mhm.
But, going back to when you're in your 20s and you're drinking and passing out, I guess you just don't think too much of it because so many other people are doing it. It looks normal.
Right.
But it's not normal. That's not normal to have blackouts. And I was not a blackout drinker at all. I had maybe one or two in high school where I didn't really remember as much. But other than that, I was not a blackout drinker. And people tend to think unless you're blacking out, you can't have a problem. And I'm here to tell you that is simply not true. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And so how old did you say you were when you became sober?
I got sober at 29.
At
And
29. And so
yeah,
what was life like for you during that time? Like in what ways was your life being impacted because of the alcohol?
well, I think I was blessed. I'll tell you, it still seems miraculous to me that I quit when I did. And I think the only reason I quit when I did is because I saw what happened to my mother hitting this horribly low bottom. Her bottom was finally, she fell down the steps at home. I was in Columbus on the phone with her. I hear a crash. I had to run across the courtyard to get my neighbor, because this is back in the day of landlines, to use his phone. I called my grandmother, who lived not that far from my mother, and my grandmother found my mother at the bottom of the steps in a pool of blood.
Mm.
So she had broken her neck.
Oh, wow.
So that was her bottom. That was her low bottom. And so I saw all of this. So my drinking, like I said, I'm in my 20s. It doesn't seem that abnormal. I I had it was leading me to make some very bad decisions. Let's put it that way. I met a guy. I was living with a roommate, and she came home one day and said she was getting married, and I was just stunned, just stunned. I think we were 19, and so my options were limited. I was waiting tables. I'm going to school, and I'm making okay money when I have a roommate, but not so much when I'm by myself. So I'm like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And to make a very long story short, I was living in this very crappy apartment on Lane Avenue by the Varsity Club, which was a bar on campus at the Ohio State. So I hear this in the upstairs apartment. I hear all this noise and phones ringing, and I go up and tell the guy to move his car. And this guy, 2 months later, we're married, right? So am I really in love, or do I just need a roommate? So I married this highly unstable guy who drank more than my mother, if that's even possible. But being young and naive, I didn't realize how much he drank exactly until we got married. And it was just another trauma-filled nightmare between his disappearing for days, very jealous man, very sick man, alcoholic, clearly. I was introduced to cocaine with him. So that started a bit of a binge for me with that. That marriage was very short-lived when he got physically violent, and I was not going to have that. Something clicked, and I write a very vivid scene where he was trying to physically attack me, threw a small portable TV at my head, missing it by millimeters. And I just snapped, and I bashed him into a cupboard door in the hall, and it drew blood on the back of his head. So it cut his head somewhere. And I think that's when he came out of a blackout, because he saw this blood dribbling down his hand. And it's like he snapped out of it, and he slunk off to bed. And I called my sister, who called my father, who drove to Columbus in the middle of the night. And there was a showdown of sorts. And this man begged my father to let him go take a shower before we had a talk at the kitchen table. And my mother was still in her addiction at this time, and she's doling out Valium around the table. And I remember her giving me a Valium to calm down. And the husband goes in to get a shower, and he never comes back. So my father says, well, what's going on? Go check out what's going on in the bathroom. And I see the shower curtain fluttering in the breeze. He jumped out the window. And to this day, I've never seen that man again, ever.
Oh, wow.
I've never seen him again. It's hysterical now when I look at it. I had to get this divorce. It was called notification of publication, where you put your intent for divorce in a newspaper. I don't know, the lawyer did it, some newspaper that probably nobody reads. And if nobody responds in 90 days, then you're show up at court with a witness, and that's the end of the show. So that was, I'm only 19, I'm clueless. And so I'm already been through that, right? So I'm married and divorced by the time I'm 21. I jumped from a chaotic, crazy home as a child into more chaos, because that's what we do when we don't change ourselves, when we don't know any better. Being with someone, I must have been drawn to someone who resembled what I was familiar with. Alcoholism, the abuse part. It's just, in my work with women now and in recovery, I see these patterns that we do. And even if they're unhealthy, that's what we're familiar with. So
yeah, absolutely. Until we break those patterns, they're just going to continue.
Exactly, Melissa. You go from one dysfunction to the next to the next. And
what was a turning point for you?
Well, the turning point was I ended up 3 years after that disastrous marriage. I met another man that we ended up getting married, and we're still married. So that's pretty amazing, everything that we've been through. But my turning point was when I worked as a flight attendant when we were living in Dallas, and my drinking, I don't know if it escalated, but it started to get a little bit abnormal. But here again, I'm in another chaotic life, irregular sleeping, I was on reserve status because I was a newer flight attendant. And so it was a lot of fun, irregular eating, irregular sleep, the whole 9 yards. So alcohol is very much a part of my life, but it's still not, I don't think, over the edge. I loved my flight attendant job. Well, what had happened was like I said, we were living in Texas. My husband's brother suddenly passed away, and we ended up moving back to Ohio. And I resumed a job I had after I married my second husband and we moved to Dayton. I worked in marketing, and I resumed this job. So I went from a flight attendant's lifestyle to having a lot of fun, meeting my husband, different cities. It's like one big date, the first year of our marriage. So everything is just fun, and it's still rather unsettled and a lot of chaos, but in a fun way. So I come back to Dayton, and that was my turning point. I'm now working a 9-to-5 job back in marketing, and my husband's working a lot, and I cannot adjust. I cannot adjust to the 9-to-5 routine. I felt like it was sucking the life right out of me. And so I found a home bar, and it was a block or two down from where I worked. And I started to, at lunchtime, I'd go have a drink, and then pretty soon it ended up becoming drinks at lunchtime. And then I'd go back to my office and shut the door and snooze and doodle, and who knows what I did. So eventually, needless to say, I got fired from that job. I was snorting Coke in the bathroom at that job because now I'm coming back to work and I really want to take a nap, but I need to wake up. So I'm starting to escalate in ways that weren't happening for me before. And my big aha moment was getting up from my office and thinking it's around noon or 1 o'clock and I need to go have lunch. And I walk over to the bar because I'm just going to have a drink at lunch. And I'm pulling on the door because it's not opening. And this feeling of panic almost, like, why is this bar not open? And after tugging on the door ferociously, I realized, I look at my watch and it's only 10:30 in the morning.
Wow.
And that scared me. Yeah, there was something about that really scared me. And so I thought, this isn't normal. Now, don't get me wrong. I didn't up and quit drinking by any stretch, but those sorts of things started to happen where I was questioning, having those conversations in my mind. When you start to ask yourself, do I drink too much? And you start to think that, you probably do. When you start to survey your friends who drink like you do and go, hey, do I drink? Do you think I'm drinking too much? And of course, they all will say no because they drink just like you. But that's not really normal. That's your conscience, your soul, whatever you want to call it, kind of flashing a little, the red flags, waving the red flags. And I tell people, are you going to listen to those or just snuff it out and keep going? And so,
Yeah.
of
So
course,
there's that part of you that is aware of what's going on, that this isn't healthy for you.
Exactly. And I really say that was all because of my mother, because she did, after her accident, she went to rehab and a doctor finally figured out, oh my goodness, this woman is an alcoholic. They sent her to rehab. She got out of rehab, got into a 12-step program, and she never looked back. And by the way, she never took another pill. The only medication my mother ever took was for high blood pressure. So she clearly was misdiagnosed. She was not manic depressive. She was not even major depressive disorder. She was an alcoholic. And once she got sober, she was no longer depressed. So I want to make that very important point because that happens to a lot of people still. Granted, there are people that have legitimate clinical depression, but I believe that should not be diagnosed until after a person is sober for at least 3 months, 6 months, because it can mimic depression. And there's really no way to know if they've been drinking since they've been a teenager like I was. How do you know if you're clinically depressed or if it's the alcohol, which is a depressant,
Right.
that's making you depressed?
Right.
So
So at what age were you when you had this turning point?
So I'm still in my 20s, but I actually, like I said, got sober at 29. So this turning
Right.
point was starting to niggle at me by the time between 27 to 29. Those were the
Okay.
2 years I think I was in where I crossed the line into active alcoholism. So for those 2 years, I felt like my drinking was becoming abnormal. I was noticing a progression in quantity. I was starting to do kind of bizarre things. Like I remember one time being on a motor scooter with a beer in each pocket and driving around my neighborhood and driving through the beer drive-through until finally the guy at the beer drive-through, I tell this story in my book, the guy at the beer drive-through was like, lady, why don't you just buy a 12-pack? And I'm like, well, I'm not going to drink that. And don't you see I'm on a motorcycle? So, I'm buying these single cans, but then I go home and I saw it. The trash can in the kitchen was overflowing with beer cans. So clearly that's why the guy at the beer drive-thru was like, lady, why don't you buy a 12-pack? Because I must have driven through there how many times? 12, 15 times.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't even connect that I was doing that until I went home and I actually saw the beer cans coming out of this trash can. And I was horrified and tied it up and ran it out to the trash. And it was like, that can't be, how did that happen? So
Is that what
yeah,
led you to eventually stop drinking?
it really did. And then finally, my husband said something to me about the drinking, and my mother was starting to chirp in my ear about the drinking. And I think one day I just snapped and thought, I can't do this anymore. It's not working for me. And I called my mom and I said, I think I need to come home because, like I said, she was 7 years sober by now and she had morphed into this amazing person. And that started my sober journey. I didn't go to rehab. I didn't go to the doctor. Because I had some knowledge of what alcoholism can look like, and especially early on. So my whole message, Melissa, is we do not have to hit these low bottoms like my mother did.
Mm-hmm.
Like so many other people do with drug addiction and alcoholism and destroy our lives. And I don't think there's enough people out there talking about what it can look like in the earlier stages, because I had people like my own husband saying, "You're not an alcoholic. You just need to get yourself together." And I said, "Well, it's the alcohol that caused a lot of emotional lability. I was very labile. I could not control my emotions once I ingested alcohol. I might be super fun, or I might be crying, or I might go off at some silly little thing and go on some verbal tirade." So that is really not who I am. So, but that is how alcohol was impacting my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to feel depressed, and I'm not a depressive kind of person.
Yeah. And so
So
what did your recovery journey look like? You said that you didn't go anywhere for any treatment.
no, I did not. I saw how well the 12 steps were working for my mother. So that's obviously the avenue that I chose and was familiar with. And so my journey started in April of '89. And I want to tell you, though, it's very difficult to get sober when from the outside everything looks fine. How did my alcoholism, though, manifest for me? I had been in and out of college for a decade and hadn't finished my degree. So that was one sign. I just had problem finishing up and sticking with things. Relationships. I never had a lot of close friends. And I don't know, I am part gypsy. And I always say, well, maybe it's the gypsy. I still don't like a lot of commitments. And it's shocking that I'm still married to the same man going on 30 plus years. Um, but I do have amazing relationships in sobriety. But I am more of a free spirit. So in recovery, I didn't I didn't really see these patterns, that I didn't have a lot of connections to others in my alcoholism. So, like we're saying, how did I get sober? So I start going to 12 steps, but I'm struggling mightily because I'm comparing myself right out of the rooms, because nothing bad had happened. Back in '89, when I got sober, there were not the number of women that there are now. There were no Facebook pages. There were no podcasts. There weren't any of these things with people talking about it. So the people that I was running into just seemed to have really long drinking histories. Most of the people were much older than I was. So it was a bit of a struggle. And finally, I did hear my story in a woman who was younger, and she talked about getting sober in her 20s. And I was like, so that was a real turning point for me. But I struggled for April, May, in '89, sober a couple months, and then I had a one-day relapse. And that one-day relapse, I was in a meeting, in a 12-step meeting, and I decided in the meeting, I'm not an alcoholic. I'm going across the street to another bar that I used to like, and I'm going to have some drinks. And that's what I did. And on the way home, I went through the beer drive-through. I seemed to not be able to pass by a drive-through without pulling in and getting something. And I bought a bottle of wine, and I went home and I drank it, and I got commode hugging sick, which was unusual because quantity wise, I had a few beers and a bottle of wine. That wasn't all that excessive, but so I got very sick, and the light went on for me, and I realized, okay, this is how it's going to be for you. And something in me just clicked, and I've been sober ever since. I went back to the recovery rooms, and I actually stopped comparing all the things that didn't happen, and I started trying to listen and relate to the similarities and how these people felt. And there were a lot of them feelings of being crippled by fear, loving chaos more than serenity. That is a huge, huge trait with a lot of alcoholics. We love chaos because that's all we've known, and we don't have other coping skills. At least I didn't. So I think not having chaos was as hard for me to give up as it was the alcohol. When in those first year of sobriety, you're like, I don't even know how to live. I don't know how to cope. I'm not sure what even people do. And I'm living with a man who still drinks. And like I said, we're young and we're with all these young professionals. My husband's a professional and we're going to dinner and everybody's drinking and I'm sitting there twiddling my thumbs. So it was a huge adjustment. But what I also did in early sobriety is when I went back to nursing school, I also was a few weeks sober and I found out I was pregnant with twins. So that was a shock. And so my first couple years of sobriety were extremely structured between school, taking care of my twins, going to meetings. That was my life for 3 years. And I think all of that structure and discipline really is what I needed to stay focused, because I don't know that I could have stayed focused. And after about a year in recovery, still angry, still rather ticked off about it all, the acceptance started to seep in. And I realized clearly, yes, I was an alcoholic. Just because I didn't ruin my health, just because I didn't get a DUI, just because I didn't drink every day, the way alcohol affected me, the way it caused my behavior to change, the fact that I couldn't seem to get my act together and finish my degree, get on with my life like most people do. Those were early signs of addiction. And I'm glad I got a hold of it when I did, because who knows how bad it could have gotten. And I didn't have to go there. And I'm very grateful that my sons have only known a sober mother. So it's really changed the way I parented too. I was a much different and far better parent sober than I know I ever could have been drunk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's great. And I mean, it's interesting how you talk about, basically, I mean, the alcohol was your identity and you took that away and now it's like you had to find a whole new identity. And that's often the case, when in a situation where someone is recovering from an addiction or even just, healing from past trauma, and all of a sudden, your life is different than it was then. And it's all about figuring out how to adapt to a new way of being, something different from what you're used to. And that in and of itself can be scary. And that can be, it makes it difficult for people to make that transition. So it's interesting, to hear about you talk about that and what that was like for you.
Well, I think it's extremely difficult, like you said, because I hear that over and over in recovery rooms. People are like, gosh, you take away the alcohol, that whole persona. But here's the great news about it. Here's the hopeful, amazing part. So I'm thinking I'm this party girl and I think I want to go into business and all these things, right? So I get sober and little by little, the real person starts to emerge. And I realize who I thought I was and who I am were vastly different, vastly different. I love nature. I am more of an introvert. I'm that, I don't know, I did that personality test. I have the one that's like only 2% of people have it. I'm a bit of an introvert with a little bit of an extrovert in there. I forget which, the INT, I don't know which one. But anyway, I love my time alone. I am recharged by time alone. I love people and I enjoy a party, but that was one thing in recovery. My husband was more social and extroverted. And in recovery, I finally said to him, you know what, pick the parties that you really want me to go with, 2 or 3 of them, especially during like the Christmas holiday. I said, I'll go, but that's it. When we were in our 20s and 30s, it was constant and it just sucked the life out of me. So those are things I learned about myself in recovery that I didn't know. I'm still a huge animal person. I love being with animals. I am obsessed with my dog. I've always had some best friend that was a four-legged friend. I've gotten now into the birds and feeding the birds. So I find a lot of joy in simple things like that I didn't know, and I didn't pursue that when I was in my addiction and my alcoholism. I was all about the bar and the party and the this and that, and that's just not who I am.
Mm-hmm.
So drinking changes us. And, like I was saying, Melissa, we can get addicted to chaos, and we can also get addicted to being the victim.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of, with trauma, it's such a multi-layered subject, because what kind of trauma? My trauma is not your trauma. And what I went through, although I found it was extremely traumatic for me, there are other people who have been through far worse, and they have found a way to move on. And then the flip side of that is working as a nurse. I see people coming in that seem to have had far less trauma than I've had, and they can't seem to escape that victim role.
Mm-hmm.
So it is so complicated, but I think things like this, to talk about it and to encourage people that whatever level of trauma you've been through, there's someone out there who has been through it and who can help you. And I think we need to give people that hope. And then the flip side of that is, though, you have to want to get out of that
Mm-hmm.
dark place because that becomes an identity too, where you're this badgered. I always felt misunderstood, that nobody ever really understood me. And I always felt sort of like a battered little child who was just kind of alone in the world. And I had to reframe that mindset and get out of that space, because the reality, that wasn't necessarily the reality. Yes, my childhood was difficult in a lot of ways, but once my mother got sober, once I got sober, I see how very ill she was. I see how my father became sicker than she was. The whole family was sick. It was a toxic environment, but I don't know that anybody intentionally set out to make it that way. So you just get a whole different perspective when you find some healing and you find recovery. For me, from my addiction, it gave me a new perspective, where I decided I had no control over what happened to me as a child. And I think most people that have a lot of trauma don't. They were victimized, because so much of the trauma happens when people are children.
Mm-hmm.
But we can move past that with the right help and the right willingness to find that help. I think that's key,
Yeah,
is to
absolutely.
want to have a different identity than the person who was abused.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like you said, everyone's experience is going to be unique, and that's why it's so important to not compare what you've been through to what someone else has been through, and how you're doing compared to how they're doing. It's about you and your journey and what's going to help you in your healing. And I love that in your recovery, you found who you are. That's so amazing.
Well, it's amazing when I see other people change. And I don't really know many sober people that haven't changed and realized, wow, they find gifts that they didn't know they had. This is another thing about addiction that really, it's so sad, is the lost brilliance, Melissa. There are so many brilliant people that are enmeshed in addiction,
Mm,
that when and if they make it out, the countless lives that have already been lost, 72,000 to the opioid epidemic,
no.
88,000 lives were lost with alcohol.
Crazy.
So these are huge numbers. Think of all the lives. And with those lost lives is lost talent,
Mm-hmm.
lost brilliance. I think that's just devastating to the world as a whole. We don't know who was the next Steve Jobs that is no longer with us. But yeah, most people that find recovery find their gifts and their talents. And it's just really cool to watch people find a gift or return to a gift that the alcohol and drugs became so important that they just stopped doing it. I know a lot who knew they had an artistic gift of some sort, and their addiction just became all consuming and pushed it aside. And then once they sobered up, they returned to that. So it is really cool to see that those people blossom into finding their gift, finding who they are, and being okay with that. And I know my husband, I was probably maybe a couple years sober, and he said to me one day, and he was stone cold sober when he said this, and I don't think he meant it as a compliment at the time, but he said, Lisa, you are nothing like the girl I married. And I was like, yes. And, it wasn't until later, I think that I know he appreciates it now. And we've had many conversations that there's no way our family could have survived had I not gotten sober, because my husband probably would have drank more if he had his drinking buddy to egg that on.
Mm-hmm.
And it would have been a disaster. There's no doubt in my mind for all of us, for my sons, and for our marriage, it probably wouldn't have lasted. So, when he said that, though, you're nothing like the person I married, I don't think he really, I think he felt a little bit like he had a bait and switch happen to him, because I got sober 4 years into our marriage. But looking
But it
back,
was a good thing, right?
yeah, it was a blessing. Absolutely. It was such a blessing.
Yeah. So how are you doing now, Lisa?
Well, I'm doing very well. I'm happy. I've been doing a lot of podcasts lately, and I'm happy to do them. I love talking about it. I wrote a book, Raising the Bottom. And so I've been blogging and things that are related to the book and talking about it. And it's become, I guess, a vocation of sorts to speak about not only my experience, but what I'm seeing in healthcare, I want people to know that you don't have to lose it all before you consider the maybe. Maybe I am an alcoholic. Maybe I do drink too much. Maybe I'm addicted to these pills from the doctor. And a lot of people, just because you get it from the doctor, that's a great excuse to keep abusing prescription drugs. I know my sister, that's the route she took, and she was a benzo addict for many years, in addition to other things. She was on street drugs and whatnot. But I know many people who justify their addictions because they get it from a doctor, and doctors don't really have a good grasp on what addiction looks like. Or maybe they don't care because they are making money by having a customer that comes back again and again. And the pharmaceutical companies love people to take medication because they
Mm-hmm.
have lifelong customers. So I think that's an aspect that we need to look at it in many cases for what it is. You're a customer, they're destroying lives, and it's justified because it's legal.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah,
That's a whole other issue.
it really is. It's a whole other podcast. Whole other
So,
subject.
so you're still a nurse today, correct?
Yes, yes, I still keep my foot in the door, and I work a couple days a week, and I like it. I'm glad that I'm still in it. So what I'm seeing, then it's relevant to what I write and talk about, because it's real time stuff as opposed to stuff that I saw happening, let's say 10 years ago, whatever. So yes, I'm still very much a part of working in healthcare, and it keeps me current. So I know what's going on, and I still like it.
That's great. Yeah, I know you've mentioned your book, Raising the Bottom. Tell us who that's for, who could benefit from reading it.
Well, Raising the Bottom the subtitle is Making Mindful Choices in a Drinking Culture. And I wrote this book for people like me. I know my mother, this is my fifth book. I used to write novels. And my mother, all the time I was writing novels, she would say, Lisa, why don't you write a book about recovery? Well, there are so many legs to that stool. And I wasn't sure what message did I want to impart. And my mother passed in 2011. She died. I made a job switch then, and it was like once I got rid of all of after I was done grieving my mom, a couple years later, the idea for Raising the Bottom just like exploded in my head. And I realized I wanted to write about people who did not lose it all. So in the book, in Raising the Bottom, I have 10 stories of other women in the back and one of a man who's now a chemical dependency counselor. But these are people who are still functioning. I have several physicians, an internist, a surgeon. One doctor was chief of staff at the hospital and landed in his own ED with a fentanyl patch in his mouth. The surgeon was still working, going to work and doing surgery during the day, coming home, opening a bottle of wine and drinking the rest of the night. And that happens in millions of homes across America and probably the world. But that can also be alcoholism. And this surgeon had a daughter and a son who were deeply affected by her drinking. They were deeply disturbed by it. And we tend to rationalize it. Our society does. Rationalizes going home and drinking every day as normal. And it's not normal. So I portray people like that, other mothers, nurses, doctors. One lady had a jewelry store. And I take the reader through a lot of what I shared earlier in the podcast is in the book about my story and then my mother's recovery story. After she was dead, I found one of her lead tapes and I transcribed it and included it. And a lot of people have reached out to me via social media and said they found so much hope with her story because she did hit such a low bottom. And then I did a chapter 2, what your kids say about you and your drinking, because I don't feel like we listen to children enough. No one listened to me as that child of an alcoholic and abusive father. And no one is listening. There's a lot of children. These women had children and their kids suffered right along with them, but in different ways. And so I feel the mommy wine culture is extremely, extremely selfish. And if anyone's offended, I don't care. It is selfish when the moms are taking their kids to the park and all they talk about is drinking. And those children now are with a mom who is not the same mom who she was before she adds alcohol. Because for most people, if you have such poor judgment that you're drinking at the park with your babies and your toddlers, you're probably already segueing or sliding down the slippery slope into alcoholism, because a normal social drinker would never think that was a good idea to then drink at the park and then load up your babies and toddlers and drive them home, put them to bed, put them down for a nap so you can pass out. Oh my gosh, this is so abnormal, but our culture has normalized it. And it scares me to death. I've heard stories, tragedies of moms who are too drunk to take their child to the emergency room, moms who are standing on the sideline holding a bottle of vodka and a water bottle, and their kid wants a drink. Their little kid says, "Mommy, I need a drink." And she's like, no, because it's vodka. We have normalized this kind of behavior, and kids remember this stuff, and it's tragic. I'm very upset with how we've normalized that. So I wrote a chapter. I wanted to give kids a voice so that people can hear what they have to say. I think they deserve for us to hear their side.
Yeah. So where can people find your book?
It's all over on all of the online places, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target, Walmart online. It's in select bookstores. You can walk in any bookstore if you want to order from an independent, and they can order it if it's not there. I know the little bookstore in Seattle has it, the three C's. So yeah, it's widely available, and you can find me at raisingthebottom.com. I've got a website. You can get it off there as well. So it's available wherever books are sold.
Okay, great. Yeah, and that'll be linked up on the show notes page for anyone who wants to check it out. So, Lisa, I have a final question that I want to ask you today. And that is, given what you know now, if you could go back to when you were going through your tough times and give yourself one piece of advice, what would it be?
I would say if you can find even a grain of honesty to self-evaluate your life, your behavior, and your actions, that little bit of honesty can be life-changing. And me being honest with myself about my drinking instead of justifying it really did change the trajectory of my life. I would not be an award-winning author. I would not be an RN. I would not have been a sober mother. None of that would have happened if I was unwilling to look at my life and the truth of what was going on in my life. It just took a little bit of willingness to consider the maybe. And that is not easy to do. It's much, much easier to rationalize and justify our behavior. But like I said earlier, if you have your conscience, that little voice whispering in your ear, I would say listen to it, because that is your conscience. That is the part of your higher self that is pointing you in the right direction. And it's telling you when you're going off, when you're veering off the track. And if we would only listen to that still small voice, I think a lot of people would have very different lives. We don't have to hit the bottom. We don't have to hit the wall. We can veer off and get some help and change our life before we've ruined a lot of others' lives too.
Yeah, I love that, because it's not always easy to be honest with ourselves. But if we can be, that's when change is going to happen. So it's so important.
Yep. It's the hardest person to be honest with is ourselves.
Mm.
I mean, know thyself, Shakespeare, he knew we lie to ourselves in a million different ways and can dress up our rationalization and justify it in a million different ways. And it's that brutal self-honesty that can change your life. And you don't have to wait. You don't have to wait till you're at rock bottom. You just don't have to.
Yeah. All right. So, Lisa, I know that you mentioned your website already. Any other ways that people can connect with you?
I'm on Instagram, Twitter at L Boucher Author. Facebook, I've got a Facebook page for, I think it's under Lisa Boucher, award-winning author. And I've also got, for the women out there, sorry guys, but I've got a Sobriety, the Benefits of a Sober Life. It's a closed group for women Facebook page that I just started a month or so ago. So that's been a great tool for people if you're sober curious, or if you're new into sobriety or long-term sobriety, or thinking about getting sober. It's another great place where it's a safe environment. You can come ask questions. You can talk to other women. You can ask for support. Wherever you are in your sober journey, that's another place. So Raising the Bottom or Sobriety, the Benefits of a Sober Life. And that's where you can find me. So I'm in all the places that I guess people would tend to look.
Okay, sounds good. And that'll be linked up on your show notes page as well. So, Lisa, I just want to thank you for coming on here today and for sharing your story with us. And I think this is going to be really inspiring and helpful for anyone who's currently battling alcohol addiction or any type of addiction right now. So thank you for sharing with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You as well. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the show today. This has been the Grass Gets Greener podcast, episode 151. Go to thegrassgetsgreener.com/Lisa Boucher, that's Boucher, to find the links mentioned during this episode or to leave a comment. So I hope you enjoyed this episode with Lisa today. As you can tell, Lisa is very passionate about this topic and wants to make a difference in the lives of others. She doesn't want anyone to have to hit that rock bottom before making a change in their lives if they're battling an addiction. And as she was talking about, we all have gifts to share with the world, and it's tragic when we don't get to share those gifts or even discover them because we're still struggling with the after effects of what we've been through. If you had something traumatic happen to you growing up and you still struggle now, or maybe you just feel unworthy, just know that you deserve to discover your gifts and to share them with the world so that others may benefit from that. Addiction or no addiction, you deserve to break free of what holds you back and discover who you truly are. And if you do struggle with an addiction and are ready to make a change, then I hope this episode has spoken to you in some way. And be sure to come back for the next episode for more inspiration. Also, head over to the website to grab your free copy of the Top 10 Strategies Guide for Survivors. In it, you'll find the top 10 most common strategies my podcast guests have used for overcoming the effects of past trauma. It's a great place to get started if you're looking for some strategies that can help you in your healing, as they have helped my guests. And you can find that at thegrassgetsgreener.com/guide or also on the show notes page. So be sure to grab that if you haven't yet. And lastly, don't forget to head over to iTunes or Stitcher to leave the show a rating and review so that we can reach as many survivors as possible. And, as always, have hope.